Mysterious women. Horror stories. Ashford Manor had been standing for over a century, hidden away in the midst of the moors. It was a place that seemed to carry the weight of history in its very walls, its silent presence looming over anyone who dared to venture near. The locals had long whispered about it, its eerie beauty, its sense of dread. But it wasn't just the manor that kept people away. It was the story of Eliza Ashford, the woman who vanished without a trace one fateful night. For decades, no one had truly understood what had happened to her. Some said she had gone mad, trapped in the house's unyielding grip. Others said she was taken by something far darker. And then, there was the music. The soft, sorrowful tune that drifted through the manor's halls every night. A melody that no one could explain. A tune that seemed to sing of lost love, despair, and the endless echo of something unfinished. Amelia Carver, a journalist in her early 30s, had heard the rumors too. But Amelia wasn't one to indulge in stories of ghosts or curses. No, she believed in the facts. The stories that could be uncovered with research and persistence. The kind of stories that could revive her career. And the mystery of Ashford Manor? Well, that was the perfect story. She'd been desperate for something that could pull her from obscurity, something that would make the world take notice. When the opportunity came to write a piece on the manor, she didn't hesitate. She packed her bags, set her mind on the task at hand, and drove toward the place that had haunted the townsfolk's conversations for years. The drive was long, winding, and increasingly desolate. As the fog rolled in and thickened around her, Amelia began to feel a strange unease settle in her chest. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the moors surrounding her like a silent, watching presence. Then, as if emerging from the very mist itself, the manor appeared on the horizon, its silhouette dark and imposing against the dimming sky. Amelia stopped her car in front of the house. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she stared at it. Her breath caught in her throat. This place, there was something about it. Something ancient, something suffocating. But she pushed the feeling aside. She wasn't here to be afraid. She was here for answers. She stepped out of the car. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of damp earth and the sharpness of the moors. The wind blew, carrying with it the faintest whisper of the song. Just a few notes, barely audible, but enough to make her shiver. Taking a deep breath, she walked up the stone path, each step heavier than the last. The door loomed before her. She pushed it open with a creak that seemed to echo through the stillness. A cold draft swept through the foyer, and the musty scent of long-forgotten rooms filled her nostrils. There were sheets draped over the furniture, as though the house had been abandoned in haste, forgotten in time. Amelia took out her flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. She stepped inside, her footfalls echoing across the vast, empty space. Her breath felt uneven as the house seemed to close in around her. The walls, peeling and cracked, whispered stories of neglect, of time standing still. She began to move through the rooms, taking notes and snapping photos, trying to focus on the task at hand. But there was something about the atmosphere, something unsettling. She felt eyes on her, watching her every move. The silence was suffocating. She moved through the rooms, studying the state of decay, the stories left behind in forgotten photographs and dusty furniture. Yet no matter how much she tried to concentrate on the job, her heart kept racing. Something was wrong here. Something beyond just the house's state of disrepair. It wasn't until she reached the second floor that the strange sensation heightened. She heard it, soft and faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind. But then it became clearer, undeniable. A melody, a song, a piano perhaps playing somewhere deep within the house. The tune, so faint yet haunting, tugged at her soul. It was as if the music called to her, beckoning her into its sorrowful embrace. Amelia stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. The melody. She couldn't remember hearing it before, and yet it felt so familiar. So old. She couldn't explain it. Her feet moved before she could think, each step toward the sound feeling like it was pulling her deeper into a trance. The hall stretched out before her, the door at the end slightly ajar, the light flickering strangely within. She walked down the hall slowly, her hand brushing against the wall, the chill of it seeping into her skin. Every step was accompanied by the distant piano music that seemed to grow louder, more insistent with every passing second. The door creaked open, and there it was. A dusty old piano sat in the far corner of the room, its keys yellowed and worn. The air inside was unnervingly cold, even though the house was stifling. The music was now louder, filling the room, yet there was no one there, no player, no source for the haunting melody. But something caught her eye. There, lying on top of the piano, was a sheet of music, yellowed and torn at the edges. The same song she had been hearing. A few faint, trembling notes echoed through her mind as she moved toward it, as though the music had become part of her, pulling her closer. Her fingers brushed over the sheet, trembling. She leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the notes. It was a melody of longing, sorrow, and something deeper, something almost pleading. She felt it. The melody. It was her. Her fingers hovered over the piano keys, aching with curiosity. She hesitated. Should she play? Was she meant to? Don't do it, she told herself. But then, her fingers pressed down, just a single note. And that's when it happened. The air turned bitterly cold. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound like thunder in the stillness. Amelia spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. There was no one there, just the eerie silence. And the music, now louder, more frantic. It wasn't just music now. It was a voice. She turned back to the piano, and that's when she saw her. A woman standing in the corner of the room, watching her with wide, dark eyes. Her hair was long, wild, and framed her face in a way that made her seem almost ethereal. Her dress, faded and tattered, looked as though it belonged to another time. The woman's presence was overwhelming, but it wasn't threatening. It was sad. Her eyes, filled with a deep sorrow, locked with Amelia's. Amelia's throat tightened. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Still, Amelia could feel her, feel the message, the plea in her eyes. The woman reached her hand out toward the piano, a single finger pointing to the sheet of music. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Amelia's hands shook as she reached for the sheet music again. The woman was watching her gaze unwavering, but Amelia felt no malice, only desperation. "Please." The woman's eyes spoke louder than words. Amelia didn't know why, but she understood. The name. Eliza Ashford. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The music, the haunting melody, the woman. It was all connected. This house, this place, held the key to a story long forgotten. Amelia held the sheet music close, her pulse racing as she realized the woman's silence was one of release. The sadness in her eyes softened as if something heavy had been lifted, and then she was gone. Just like that. The room returned to its former stillness. The cold air receded. The music, now silenced, hung in the air like a distant memory. Amelia stood there for what felt like an eternity, her hands still trembling. She knew now she had been a part of something. She had uncovered a story that had been locked away, unheard for so long. She left the room, her heart heavy but full, the woman's sorrowful presence lingering in her mind. And as Amelia walked through the halls of Ashford Manor, she understood. It was never just about uncovering the truth. It was about hearing the silent song of the past. And now, the house would never be the same. Ravenwood Manor stood tall on the edge of a dense forest, its silhouette etched sharply against the overcast sky. For over a century, The mansion had been a monument to mystery, its towering spires and crumbling facade shrouded in secrets. The townsfolk of Marlow spoke of it in hushed tones, weaving tales of ghostly whispers, unexplained disappearances, and restless spirits. But to Kara Whitfield, these were just stories. As a journalist, she lived for uncovering the truth. Her career was built on logic, not superstition. So, when she inherited the sprawling estate from a distant relative, one she hadn't even known existed, her first instinct was to sell it. Yet, standing before the ominous structure, curiosity ignited a spark within her. "What's the real story here?" she murmured, her voice swallowed by the chill autumn air. If Ravenwood's walls held secrets, she was determined to unearth them. The mansion greeted her with silence, thick, heavy, and unnatural. Kara parked her car at the base of the driveway, the gravel crunching underfoot as she approached the towering double doors. Their once grand surface was marred by cracks and weathered carvings. She pushed them open with a creak that echoed like a lament. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of decaying wood and forgotten time. Her boots tapped against the marble floor as she stepped further in, each sound amplified by the cavernous space. The grandeur of the interior was undeniable, but so was its decay. Dusty chandeliers hung precariously, and faded portraits stared down from the walls with hollow eyes. Kara exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the eerie sensation creeping along her spine. "It's just an old house," she whispered, as though convincing herself. That first night, Kara set up camp in the study, a room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that seemed to sag under the weight of countless forgotten stories. She lit a fire in the hearth, its warmth a small comfort against the mansion's persistent chill. As she sorted through documents left behind, a sound broke the silence. A whisper. Kara froze, her fingers hovering over a faded photograph. The sound was faint, like a breath carried on the wind. She tilted her head, straining to listen. "Hello?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. No reply. The whisper came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. Kara stood, her heart pounding, and scanned the room with her flashlight. The beam swept over the antique desk, the dusty armchair, the darkened corners. Nothing. She exhaled shakily, forcing a laugh. "Old houses make noises," she said aloud, her voice trembling at the edges. But the unease lingered, a shadow in her mind. The next morning, Kara explored the mansion further, determined to uncover its secrets. In the east wing, she found a locked door, with an ornate brass handle tarnished by time. After some searching, she discovered a small key hidden in a drawer, and with effort, forced the door open. The room beyond was frozen in time. A grand four-poster bed dominated the space, its canopy draped in cobwebs. On the vanity sat a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and aged. Kara's fingers trembled as she opened it, revealing elegant handwriting on the first page. Lenora Ravenscroft. The early entries were mundane, detailing lavish parties and the mundanity of solitude. But as she read further, the tone darkened. "The whispers began after the winter solstice," one entry read. "They call my name, luring me toward the woods. I cannot sleep, I feel them. Watching." Kara's breath quickened. The final entry sent a chill down her spine. "They will not stop until I join them. If someone finds this, know I had no choice." The date was nearly a century ago. Lenora Ravenscroft had disappeared, her fate shrouded in mystery. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. Kara sat in the living room, her pen poised over her notebook when the sound began. A faint murmur at first, growing into a chorus of indistinct voices. She gripped the pen tightly, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the empty space. The whispers swirled around her, filling the room like an invisible storm. Driven by a compulsion she couldn't explain, Kara followed the sound. It led her down a long, shadowed corridor to the ballroom. The massive room was bathed in moonlight, its once glorious mirrors reflecting fractured light. At the center stood a figure, a woman. Kara's breath hitched. The figure was ethereal, her form shimmering as though crafted from mist. She wore a flowing gown that seemed to ripple in an unseen breeze, and her eyes were deep pools of sorrow. "You came," the woman said softly, her voice lilting like a distant melody. Kara swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, a sad smile ghosting her lips. "I am Lenora." Kara's pulse thundered in her ears. "But you disappeared a century ago." Lenora's gaze drifted to the ballroom windows, her expression wistful. "The forest? It binds those who listen to its call. It claimed me, and now it seeks you." Fear coiled in Kara's chest. Why? Why me? Lenora stepped closer, her translucent form flickering like a candle in the wind. "The Whispers have chosen you. They thrive on fear, on loneliness. But you can resist." The air grew colder, the atmosphere thick with an unseen force. Lenora's form began to fade, her voice a haunting echo. "Beware the woods. Beware the Whispers." In the days that followed, the Whispers became relentless. They seeped into Kara's dreams, coiling around her thoughts. The once grand mansion now felt like a trap, its walls closing in. Every attempt to leave was thwarted. Her car refused to start. The forest blocked the roads. Even her phone, a modern lifeline, was rendered useless. Desperation drove her back to Lenora's journal. Her eyes lingered on one passage. "They thrive on fear and loneliness. You must stand firm. Do not let them consume you." Kara clung to those words like a lifeline. That final night, the Whispers reached a deafening crescendo. Compelled by an invisible force, Kara found herself at the edge of the forest. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches clawing at the starless sky. In a moonlit clearing, she saw them, shadowy figures cloaked in mist, their faces obscured. At the center stood Lenora, her eyes filled with urgency. "You can still break free," Lenora whispered. "But you must fight." The whispers grew louder, their weight pressing down on Kara like a suffocating shroud. Her voice broke through the chaos, raw and defiant. "No, I won't be part of this." The figures wavered, their forms dissolving into the night. The forest trembled, and then silence. Kara awoke in her car at the edge of the driveway. Ravenwood Manor loomed in the distance, dark and silent. The Whispers were gone, but their memory lingered, etched into her soul. As she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees, she thought she heard faint voices. The Whispers. This is The Mysterious Women, horror story number 3. The midnight train rattled softly, cutting through the dense silence of the countryside. Outside, the world was a void, just black shapes of trees and hills shifting in the shadows of the night. Sienna Moore sat by the window, her reflection faint against the dark glass. She sighed, running her fingers through her auburn hair, her thoughts swirling with everything that had led her to this moment. This trip was supposed to be a fresh start, a reset, a chance to finish her book, reconnect with herself, and escape. The train carriage was quiet, too quiet. Most passengers were asleep, their heads slumped against the windows or tucked into scarves. It should have felt peaceful, but instead, the silence pressed on her chest, heavy and unrelenting. She pulled her jacket tighter and turned back to the window. That's when she saw her. A woman, sitting several rows ahead, in the dim glow of the flickering overhead light. Sienna frowned. She didn't remember seeing anyone sit there before, and yet, there she was. The woman sat unnaturally still, her head tilted slightly, as though she was listening to something. Her dark hair hung limp and damp around her face, clinging to her pale skin. There was something about her stillness that made Sienna's stomach twist, a sense that the woman didn't belong. "No," Sienna whispered, shaking her head. "I'm just overtired." She forced her eyes back to the book in her lap, trying to focus on the printed words. But her gaze kept drifting, kept returning to the figure ahead. The train screeched, jolting her from her thoughts. They had stopped. Another station. Sienna glanced out the window, expecting to see platforms and bustling commuters. Instead, there was only mist. Thick gray fog clung to the ground, swallowing everything beyond the faint yellow glow of a single street lamp. Sienna's breath hitched as the woman stood suddenly. Her movements were fluid but deliberate. Too deliberate. She watched, frozen, as the woman glided down the aisle. No bag, no hesitation. Just the soundless rhythm of her steps. At the doors, the woman paused. Slowly, she turned her head. Sienna's heart stopped. Her face. It was pale, ghostly white, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer straight through her. And then she was gone, disappearing into the fog like a shadow swallowed by the night. The train jerked forward again, and Sienna let out a shaky breath. "It's fine," she murmured to herself, her voice trembling. Just tired. That's all." But the silence now felt suffocating, wrapping around her like a damp blanket. She glanced around, expecting to see the other passengers, but the seats were empty. Her chest tightened. Where did everyone go?" She stood, her legs shaky, and moved through the carriage. One by one, she checked the rows, then the next car, and the next. Each one was the same, empty. Panic bubbled in her throat. She hurried back to her seat, her fingers gripping the armrests as she tried to calm her racing heart. And then she felt it. A presence. She looked up slowly, and there she was. The woman, sitting 2 rows ahead. Sienna's breath came in shallow gasps. She had seen her leave, had watched her disappear. Her hands trembled as she stood. Her voice cracked as she called out, "Excuse me, are you okay?" No response. Sienna swallowed hard and took a cautious step forward. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Still nothing. She reached out, her hand hovering over the woman's shoulder. And then, in an instant, the woman turned. Her face was inches from Sienna's. Her skin was icy, her eyes black voids that seemed to pull at her very soul. The air around them grew cold, so cold Sienna's breath clouded in front of her. A faint whisper escaped the woman's lips, her voice carrying a chill that seeped into Sienna's bones. "You shouldn't have stayed." The world tilted, and before Sienna could scream, the woman vanished. The train screeched to a halt again. This time there was no station, no platform, just darkness. Sienna stumbled to the door, peering out into the void. Her heart pounded as the silence grew, pressing against her ears. And then she heard it. A whisper, faint at first, like a distant breeze brushing past her ear. "Sienna." Her blood ran cold. She turned, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, louder this time. "Sienna." The lights flickered violently, and shadows began to move in the corners of the carriage. At first they were faint, but soon they took shape. Tall, dark figures with no faces. Her breathing grew ragged as they moved closer, their steps slow and deliberate. She backed away, her mind racing. This isn't real. This can't be real. But the figures kept coming. Desperate, Sienna scrambled toward the emergency exit. Her fingers fumbled with the lever, panic clouding her mind. "Open!" she cried, yanking the door with all her strength. Finally it slid open, revealing the rushing wind and pitch-black night outside. The figures loomed closer, their faceless heads tilting as if in mockery. And then she heard her voice. The woman. "Jump," she whispered, her tone soft yet commanding. Sienna froze. The figures were nearly upon her, their dark forms swallowing the light. Her instincts screamed at her to move, but her legs refused to obey. "Jump," the voice repeated louder this time. With a strangled cry, Sienna leapt into the darkness. When she awoke, she was lying in a field. The grass was damp beneath her, and the cool night air stung her cheeks. Slowly she sat up, her head pounding. The train tracks stretched into the distance, but the train itself was gone, vanished without a trace. Sienna's breaths came in shallow bursts as she scanned the horizon. In the distance, faint lights marked the outline of a small town. She stumbled to her feet, her body aching as she began to walk toward the lights. But as she reached the edge of the field, she hesitated. Something made her turn back. The tracks lay silent under the moonlight, the air calm and still. But deep in her chest she felt it, a presence. And as the wind whispered through the trees, she thought she heard her name. Even now, sitting alone in the safety of her cabin, Sienna sometimes hears it, a faint voice just beyond the edge of hearing, calling her. The silent passenger wasn't gone. She was waiting.